Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. We are an educational channel, and today is our 187th Bible Decode, all coming from the New Testament. And we've been chopping up the Roman origins hypothesis, which you may have to listen to an early one of my Bible decodes to get in its fullness. I'm going to try something a little bit different today and just be much more brief about explaining the Roman origins hypothesis and kind of get into the material and then maybe flesh it out as we go through. Well, basically, the Roman origins hypothesis is that the Romans are the ones who wrote the New Testament. In particular, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, which includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons Titus and Domitian, between 69 and 96 AD. And they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 years. At the same time, they wrote a history of a war that they participated in called War of the Jews, between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. They wrote that under the name of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, after the Flavian dynasty. And if you compare the two works, Josephus' 7-volume War of the Jews and the Gospels in particular, you will be floored by the amount of parallels between the two. They were written together as a complementary, two complementary pieces that were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. We know that Josephus was Flavian, at least by adoption, and he emanated from Rome. His work emanated from Rome and was endorsed enthusiastically by Emperor Titus. And therefore, we also know that Josephus, whoever Josephus was, also wrote the New Testament, or at least the Gospels. But I would argue the entire New Testament. And many other, the Apocrypha and the Church Fathers, and so on and so forth. But the Romans, if you watch my earlier videos, you'll see they had the motive, the method, and the opportunity to do so. And the amount of parallels between the two are legion, and they are staggering once you kind of figure out how to read it. One easy example is that the 3-year ministry of Jesus is mirrored or mirrors the 3-year military campaign of Titus in War of the Jews. Every place that Jesus goes, Titus goes. They go to these places, these locations, in the same order, and everything that happens to Titus is a mirror of what happens to Jesus, in terms of it's a parallel event. Not exactly the same event, but the same type of event, the analogous events. And then the events are all spaced by 40 years. The Jewish War, Titus's campaign from 70 to 73 AD, Jesus' campaign from 30 to 33 AD. And we're talking about like dozens of events, 40 to 45 events. And that was uncovered by Joseph Atwill. But Michael Menescot's, in his new book called Christianity's Origin, as a Flavian secrecy cult, he found over 250 parallels between just the book of Luke and War of the Jews. So we have hashed, and we went through all of Menescot's book in earlier Bible decodes, and then we went and looked at work of Christian apologetics called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and he was a court reporter who went around the country and interviewed various Christian theologian scholars, and kind of tried to make the case, like the legal case, for the for Christ as we kind of see him in the Gospels, and that we're taught to believe in him. But I went through this book because it really shows they're not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis, and so they think they're making the case for Christ, but really they are making the case for Caesar, because so many times in the book, the author or the interviewee is, ends up saying, well, there is no other explanation, or I challenge somebody to find a better explanation than God did it. I challenged somebody to find a better explanation for the resurrection than it was done by God, or by supernatural means. And it's like, okay, here's the Roman origins hypothesis. It wasn't done by God, it was done by the Romans. And here's how they did it, here's why they did it, and they've done many, many things like this in the past, and in the present. In the present back then in the first century. So now we're looking at the opposite, kind of a Christian opposition book, which is by David Fitzgerald, called Nailed. And he goes into the story of the Gospels, and he kind of tries to rip it to shreds. But he is also unaware of the Roman origins hypothesis, and I think it also affects his interpretation. And as I've said in previous videos, I find the atheistic scientism position to be just as bad as if not worse, than the Christian position. Because at least the Christian position gives you something to hang your hat on. And the Romans wanted you to be a good citizen. They wanted you to be a hardworking, law-abiding, respectable citizen. And so most Christians are law-abiding, respectable citizens. Whereas atheism is just kind of like a free-for-all. And it mostly is just like worship of science, and we have seen, with our own eyes over the last 5 years, how science can be so easily perverted by money interests and so on, power interests, that it's even less believable than God did it. Okay, so we're going through some of his book. He really presents kind of like the 10 main myths that Christians talk to you like this is really true, but are they really true? And at this point, he's talking about some of the gospel authors, and really that the gospel authors were anonymous, and that they originally anonymous, and eventually they got names, the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark, but that wasn't part of it at the beginning. That only happened in the late 2nd century, and he points out that at many places throughout all of the Gospels, all 4 Gospels were originally anonymous. None claimed to be written by eyewitnesses. All contained giveaways that they were written generations later by well-educated Greek-speaking theologians, not illiterate Aramaic speakers. Now, if he had the Roman origins hypothesis, he could put 2 and 2 together and figure out who these well-educated Greek-speaking theologians were. If you're not aware, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, which is the language of the Romans. Which sounds like that would be, that wouldn't make sense. I thought Latin was the language of the Romans. Latin was really the language of the Roman government and the elite Caesars. They used that language along with Greek, but Greek was kind of like the street language of the first century Roman Empire, first century Rome. In Judea, there was Greek, but it was much more rare than what they spoke, which was Aramaic, which is a Semitic language very similar to Hebrew, I believe. Same letters, I believe. Okay, Luke's gospel opens by telling us his story has been handed down to his generation. And Matthew occasionally lets it slip that he is writing long afterwards, such as when he described the Jewish authorities' cover-up of the resurrection, reported among the Jews until this day. And he says that later also, unto this day, in Matthew 27:8. That was the original one is Matthew 28:15. So in just two chapters, he says it twice. And let's see, he also says, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Matthew 10:23. I'm not sure exactly. Why would a real eyewitness like Matthew need to plagiarize the bulk of someone else's story who wasn't an eyewitness, as Matthew has? He pointed out earlier that there are, I believe, 661 verses in Matthew, and 607 of them are taken directly from Mark. Like, so 92% of Matthew is taken directly from Mark. And he says, if Mark received his gospel from Peter, why is it that he asks, why is it that the other gospels have more anecdotes about Peter? So Mark was supposed to have received the gospel from Peter. Mark was not there, but Peter was. But Matthew is supposed to have been there. So why is he quoting Mark, who wasn't there? And then apparently the other Gospels have more anecdotes about Peter than Mark does. Now, Luke also copies from Mark about 55%, so a lot less than Matthew, but still quite a bit. So those three synoptic Gospels are all really telling the same story, pretty much in the same order, and there's some minor changes, like Mark makes a lot of geographical errors and some errors about some history and stuff like that are actually corrected by Matthew, but not corrected by Luke. So I find that very interesting. I'm going to, when I read the Gospels next time, I'm going to try to chart all those things. Mark shows no understanding of the social situation in the Holy Land, making numerous errors that no one living in early first century Judea would have made. Matthew is constantly correcting Mark's blunders about all aspects of Jewish society: religion, the calendar, holidays, customs, attitudes, even misquoted scripture. Mark 7:31 tells us Jesus departed from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee, which even my limited understanding of the geography of Syria and Palestine shows me that is he's taking a big detour. And he says, in the region of Decapolis, a trip 50 miles out of his way on foot. Though Luke appears very familiar, and this is an interesting point that goes to a lot of things that Roman Piso, who is another Roman origins hypothesis guy, talks about, especially in the book of Acts. Scholars believe that the book of Luke and the book of Acts were kind of companion pieces written by Luke. So Luke wrote the book of Acts. If you know, with the Roman origins hypothesis, none of this, Luke, Mark, Matthew, none of these people existed. It was all written by Josephus, whoever Josephus was. But he says Luke appears very familiar with Rome's sites and taverns. Roman Piso says that Acts kind of gives you a map of all of the brothels in Rome, and not just in Rome, throughout Asia Minor, which is Turkey, and also Greece. So all the places that Paul, goes and gives his letters and so on. So Luke appears very familiar with Rome's sites and taverns, and Acts is a roadmap to the brothels, which, many brothels in the ancient world were run by the church. So that's not a huge stretch. Not only does he not know much Aramaic, meaning Luke, not only does he not know much Aramaic, but he has little knowledge of Judea itself, because he follows Mark's blunders while Matthew corrects them. So if you're looking for the correct interpretations of the religion, the calendar, holidays, customs, attitudes, and scripture, you want to read Matthew, because Mark and Luke make a lot of mistakes as far as that goes. He says there are indications that John has been re-edited and expanded. And now he's looking at a new one of the myths, which is that the Gospels portray a consistent version of Jesus. And he pushes back against that. First, he says Mark's Jesus is a fallible, suffering human. There's no miraculous account of his birth. His story begins when he becomes God's son at his baptism. He is a secret Messiah, not only denying that he is God, but hiding his true identity, disguising his message, and teaching his followers in secret. Mark's Jesus uses traditional pagan magic techniques, like spitting in your eye or to fix your eyes, which Emperor Vespasian does that as well, and magic words to heal the blind. I don't remember him using any magic words. To heal the blind and deaf, but not always successfully. There is an instance, I guess that is in Mark, where Jesus tries to heal somebody's sight and fails, or partially succeeds. They see something very blurry. I think it's like they see the trees dancing or something like that. I think that is in Mark 7 and 8. Mark, the end of chapter 7 and beginning of chapter 8 of Mark. Jesus loses his temper sometimes in Mark 8:33 and 9:19, and with inanimate objects, with the fig tree, which is in Mark 11:12. He can even be a bit of a jerk. He initially refuses to cast out a devil from a Gentile woman's daughter. And I believe that is where Jesus comes the very closest to saying something negative about the Romans. Now, that goes with the Roman origins hypothesis. You know, the Romans wrote the story of Jesus as a psychological operation to pacify or tame or domesticate the Jews who had been a pain in the side or a thorn in the side of the Romans for over 100 years, with constant uprisings and insurrections and wars. And so they attempted to, instead of a Jewish Messiah who was a military commander to throw out the Romans, they proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, and so on. And this is evident when you read the Gospels, and Jesus never says anything against the Romans. This is the closest that he gets when he initially refuses to cast out a devil from a Gentile woman's daughter. Now he's talking about Matthew correcting Mark's mistakes about basic Judaism, not repeating his geographical errors, and expanding on the narrative. And so Matthew gives us a dark and suspenseful nativity story, a suitable genealogy, a longer ending embellishing Jesus' deeds and attributes, and beefing it up with plenty of miracles throughout. Matthew's Jesus is also a most Jewish Jesus, a rabbi who upholds the Torah, insisting not one jot or stroke of the law will pass away. He wears a prayer shawl, observes the Sabbath, teaches, worships, and heals in synagogues as well as the temple. And he says he also fixes mistakes Jesus makes, even removing anything that makes Jesus look less than perfect. So while Mark is showing you a kind of a fallible Jesus, Matthew gets rid of all of that and shows you a perfection. So he says, for example, in Mark 6:5, Jesus is unable to do any mighty work in his hometown and is amazed at their unbelief. Matthew will have none of that. He cuts out Jesus being taken by surprise and changes could not do mighty works to did not do mighty works. Matthew is also not above taking verses out of context, citing prophecies that either weren't about the Messiah or weren't prophecies in the first place, which he does in Matthew 1:23, Matthew 27:9, and Matthew 2:13. Even prophecies that no one has ever managed to find, Matthew 2:23. He goes so far as to deliberately alter scriptures to fit what he wants them to say. He cuts out whole generations of Jesus' genealogy to make it fit his numerological scheme. I think that's the 14 thing. 14 generations back to David, and 14 more generations back to Abraham, and then 14 generations back to Adam. Luke's Jesus, by contrast, is serene, beatific, and unflappable. And when Luke is not copying from either Matthew or Mark, mostly Mark, he is totally incompatible with either. Unlike Matthew, Luke gives us a happy, angst-free nativity story and a brand new genealogy for his perfect Jesus, which is irreconcilable with Matthew's version of his genealogy. And both of those, the genealogy of Matthew and the genealogy of Luke, these are the same two gospels that present the story of the virgin birth. So which is it? Is it a virgin birth, or is Jesus fit in with some type of genealogy coming down from the Father? Is Joseph the father, or is God the Father? It really, it's hard to make it both. Jesus does not have Joseph's blood if he is the virgin birth. But both of them present, Luke and Matthew present both the genealogy and the virgin birth. And he says, right from the manger, Luke's Jesus is wonderful and flawless. He talks about when he was 12 and he amazes his exasperated parents when they lose him for a few days. Incidentally, I've been reading, or I did read recently, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is part of the Apocrypha. And that goes to Jesus' very, very early days. And, there's a point when he's like 5 years old where he gets frustrated with one of his friends and basically he drops dead. His friend drops dead. Drops dead. I think he also made a priest drop dead that he was disagreeing with when he was like 8 years old, but then he brought him back to life later. But it's really hokey though. This Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It's stuff that it's right out of the Santa Claus. It's just a nursery rhyme. These are all just nursery rhymes. There's no evidence for any of this. All the evidence for the existence of Jesus is Roman. It has Roman origins. This is a Roman psyop. Okay, let's see. Luke's Jesus never feels despair, doubt, or fear and remains unfazed in tight corners. In Matthew or in Luke, Jesus is unperturbable. He doesn't feel the need to take Peter, James, and John along for any moral support. Nor does he become distressed or agitated or sorrowful unto death. He doesn't collapse to the ground, but simply kneels and prays just once, asking God politely if he would be willing to please remove the cup. He doesn't berate the disciples or rub it in with any snide zingers at the end like Mark and Matthew. There's only a single point in Luke's gospel where Jesus is less than dignified perfection. As he prays in the garden, an angel from heaven suddenly appears to him to give him strength. Then in his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood. Which Lee Strobel found a scholar who was willing to explain the medical condition that causes you to sweat blood. And he indicates that the amount of blood that you do sweat in this particular medical situation, whatever it's called, is very, very, very minor. But so basically they go that far to make sure that, like, even this comment about him sweating blood, even that is true. It's like, how can you be that naive? Okay, this, he refers to the Luke as Zen master mode. He says, one important reason is that the pair of angel and bloody sweat verses are absent from many of our most reliable manuscripts. Well, maybe that is why this scholar bent over backwards to show that it was legit. He didn't, by the way, in that passage, they never mentioned that is absent from many of our most reliable manuscripts. I'd like to see some more details about that. Luke dispenses with the words of the 22nd Psalm altogether and takes his Jesus' parting line from Psalm 31:5. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And contradicting Mark's Jesus, Luke repeats Matthew's parable in virtually identical language, that the Lord will not be right back during his followers' lifetimes after all. By contrast, John, which is not part of the synoptic gospels, it is a kind of a separate gospel that doesn't follow the main narrative of Mark, and that refers to the other gospels very little and is much more mystical and almost Gnostic in its orientation. He says, John's Jesus is a Superman without a Clark Kent. Not only is he no secret Messiah at all, he has a radically, different personality. Much more large and in charge, in total control at all times. This Jesus knows he's God, and he doesn't care who knows it. He's constantly talking about his divinity and declaring himself to be the bread of life in John 6:35, and again in 6:41 and in 6:48. The living bread that came down from heaven. The light of the world in 8:12 and 9:5. And from above and not of this world in 8:23. The Son of Man, 8:28. The Good Shepherd, the resurrection and the life in 11:25. The way and the truth and the life in 14:6. And the true vine in 15:1.